ومن الناس من يتخذ من دون الله أندادا يحبونهم كحب الله والذين آمنوا أشد حبا لله ولو يرى الذين ظلموا إذ يرون العذاب أن القوة لله جميعا وأن الله شديد العذاب.
Yet among men, some take others as equals to Allah, and love them as Allah alone should be loved. But those who truly believe, they love Allah more than all else. If only the wrongdoers were to perceive now, as they will perceive when they will see the chastisement, that all power belongs to Allah alone, and in that Allah is severe in chastisement. Yet among men, some take others as equals to Allah. There are certain attributes which belong exclusively to God. Moreover, there are certain duties that man owes to God by virtue of His being his Lord. The indictment of the Quran is that the people in question ascribe to others than God the attributes which are exclusively His, and likewise consider others to be the rightful claimants of certain rights over man which belong only to God. To be Lord of the entire complex of causal relationships found in the universe, to dispense the needs and requirements of people, to deliver them from distress and affliction, to heed complaints and respond to lamentations and prayers, and having full knowledge of all that is apparent as well as all that is hidden, are the exclusive attributes of God. Furthermore, there are certain rights which God alone may claim, that His creatures should recognize Him alone as their sovereign, prostrate themselves before Him alone in recognition of their bondage to Him, turn to Him alone for the fulfillment of their prayers, call Him alone for help and succor, place their trust in none save Him, center their hopes and expectations only in His munificence, and fear Him alone both in public and in private. In the same way, being the only absolute sovereign of the universe, it befits none save God to lay down what is permitted and what is prohibited for His subjects, to prescribe their rights and duties, to command them what to do and what not to do, to direct them as to how the energy and resources bestowed on them by God should be expended. Again, it is God alone who can ask His subjects to acknowledge His sovereignty, to accept His commands as a source of law, to consider Him alone to be the Lord entitled to command men, to consider His commands supreme, and to turn to Him alone for correct guidance. Whoever either ascribes to any being other than God any of the aforementioned attributes, or recognizes the claim of anyone save God to be entitled to any of the above-mentioned rights over His creatures, is in fact setting up that being as a rival to God, and placing him on the same plane as God. By the same token, any individual or institution claiming to possess any of the exclusive attributes and rights of God, as mentioned above, is in fact claiming a position parallel and equal to that of God, even though the claim to Godhead may not have been categorically spelled out. But those who truly believe, they love Allah more than all else. True faith requires that a man should give absolute priority to seeking God's good pleasure and should hold nothing too dear to sacrifice for the sake of God.
إذ تبرأ الذين اتبعوا من الذين اتبعوا ورأوا العذاب وتقطعت بهم الأسباب.
At that moment, those who have been followed will disown their followers, and they will see the chastisement, and their resources will be cut asunder.
وقال الذين اتبعوا لو أن لنا كرة فنتبرأ منهم كما تبرأوا منا كذلك يريهم الله أعمالهم حسرات عليهم وما هم بخارجين من النار.
And the followers will then say, "Oh, if only we might return again, we would disown them as they have disowned us." Thus Allah will show them their works in a manner which will cause them bitter regrets. Never will they come out of the fire. We would disown them as they have disowned us. Here, particular reference is made to the dismal end of those so-called religious leaders who misled people and of their gullible followers who fall easy prey to their deception. This has been done in order to warn the Muslims to beware of the errors which misled former nations, and to impress upon them the need to develop the capacity to distinguish between true and spurious leaders so as to avoid being led by the latter.
يا أيها الناس كلوا مما في الأرض حلالا طيبا ولا تتبعوا خطوات الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين.
O men, eat of the lawful and pure things in the earth, and follow not in the footsteps of Satan. For surely he is your open enemy, and follow not in the footsteps of Satan. The demand made here is that they should violate all those taboos in matters of food and drink which have their basis in superstitious beliefs or irrational usages.
إنما يأمركم بالسوء والفحشاء وأن تقولوا على الله ما لا تعلمون.
He only commands you to evil and indecency, and to attribute to Allah the things concerning which you have no knowledge. And to attribute to Allah the things concerning which you have no knowledge. The notion that all superstitious customs and taboos are God-given religious teachings is an example of satanic deception, pure and simple, since there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that they are from God.
وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمُ اتَّبِعُوا مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ قَالُوا بَلْ نَتَّبِعُ مَا أَلْفَيْنَا عَلَيْهِ آبَاءَنَا أَوَلَوْ كَانَ آبَاؤُهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ شَيْئًا وَلَا يَهْتَدُونَ.
And when they are told, follow what Allah has revealed, they say, no, we shall follow what we found our forefathers practicing. What? Even if their forefathers lacked understanding and right guidance, they say, no, we shall follow what we found our forefathers practicing. The only possible argument and justification for these taboos was that they had been sanctified by the practice of their forefathers, from whom they had allegedly come down generation after generation. Fickle-minded as they were, they deemed this argument to be sufficiently persuasive.
وَمَثَلُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا كَمَثَلِ الَّذِي يَنْعِقُ بِمَا لَا يَسْمَعُ إِلَّا دُعَاءً وَنِدَاءً صُمٌّ بُكْمٌ عُمْيٌ فَهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ.
Those who have refused to follow the way of Allah resemble cattle. When the shepherd calls them, they hear nothing except shouting and crying. They are deaf, dumb, and blind, and so they understand nothing. When the shepherd calls them, they hear nothing except shouting and crying. This parable has two aspects. On the one hand, it suggests that these people are like herds of irrational animals, dumb cattle that always follow their herdsmen, moving on as they hear their calls without understanding what they mean. Thus these people follow their leaders even though they do not grasp where it is they're being led to. On the other hand, it also suggests that when the truth is preached to them, they show such insensitivity to it that one may as well be addressing animals who merely comprehend sounds but are incapable of understanding their meaning. The expression lends itself to both interpretations.
يا أيها الذين آمنوا كلوا من طيبات ما رزقناكم واشكروا لله إن كنتم إياه تعبدون.
Believers, eat of the pure things wherewith we have provided you for sustenance, and give thanks to Allah if it is Him that you serve. Believers, eat of the pure things we have provided you for sustenance, and give thanks to Allah. The believers are told that if by having believed they have committed themselves to following the law of God as they claim, then they should abandon all taboos and prohibitions imposed by the pundits and priests, by the rabbis and church fathers, by the monks and recluses, and by their own forefathers. Although they were required to abstain from whatever had been prohibited by God, they ought to feel no compunction with regard to consuming all that He had permitted. This has also been alluded to in the saying of the Prophet reported in a tradition in the following words: "Whoever prays in our manner, turns towards our Qibla in prayer, and eats the flesh of our slaughtered animals, that person is Muslim." This means that in spite of praying and facing towards the Qibla, a person is not fully assimilated into Islam as long as he maintains the pre-Islamic taboos in matters of eating and drinking, and holds on to the fetters of superstition forged by the victims of ignorance. A person's adherence to these taboos is indicative of the fact that the poison of ignorance continues to flow in his veins.
إنما حرم عليكم الميتة والدم ولحم الخنزير وما أهل به لغير الله فمن اضطر غير باغ ولا عاد فلا إثم عليه إن الله غفور رحيم.
He has made unlawful to you only carrion and blood and the flesh of swine, and that over which there has been pronounced the name of someone other than Allah. There shall be no sin upon him who is constrained to eat them, even though he neither covets them nor exceeds the indispensable need. Allah is all forgiving, all compassionate. And that over which there has been pronounced the name of someone other than Allah. This applies to the flesh of an animal slaughtered in the name of anything and anyone other than God, as well as to the food prepared as an offering to someone other than God. God alone is the master of everything, of the animal whose flesh we consume, as well as of every other kind of food. And it is He who has mercifully provided us with them. Hence, if it is appropriate to pronounce any name as an expression of gratitude, of consecration, it can only be the name of God. To use anyone else's name means that we believe that there is some other being either instead of or in addition to God which deserves to be acknowledged as our Lord and benefactor. Allah is all forgiving, all compassionate. This verse grants permission to use prohibited things with 3 stipulations. First, one must not be in a state of extreme compulsion. For example, being gravely ill or being so hungry and thirsty that one's very life is in danger, and a prohibited thing is all that is available to save one's life. Second, the person concerned should have no inclination to violate the law of God. Third, in consuming the prohibited thing, one should not exceed the limits of bare necessity. If a few bites or a few drops are enough to save one's life, one ought not to go beyond the absolute minimum.
إن الذين يكتمون ما أنزل الله من الكتاب ويشترون به ثمنا قليلا أولئك ما يأكلون في بطونهم إلا النار ولا يكلمهم الله يوم القيامة ولا يزكيهم ولهم عذاب أليم.
Those who conceal anything of the book sent down by Allah and sell it away for a trifling gain are merely filling their bellies with fire. Allah will neither address them on the day of resurrection, nor shall He pronounce them pure. A painful chastisement lies in store for them, are merely filling their bellies with fire. This means that the blame for the growth of whole new codes consisting of superstitions, perverted customs, and unjustifiable taboos lay squarely on the shoulders of those religious scholars who had knowledge of the scriptures but failed to transmit their knowledge to the common people. Moreover, later, when erroneous practices began to spread among them, they remained mute spectators of this drama. Indeed, some of them kept willfully silent about these matters, thinking that their interests would be better served if the scripture remained a sealed book and its injunctions were kept beyond the access of the common people. Nor shall he pronounce them pure. This is a refutation of the false claims made by their religious leaders and a clarification of the misconceptions regarding their positions and privileges which these leaders had been spreading among the common people. They spared no efforts to give the impression that they were sacred beings and that anyone who attached himself to them would necessarily earn God's forgiveness through their intercession. Here, God is telling them that He takes no notice of people who are unworthy to intercede for themselves, let alone able to intercede for others.
أولئك الذين اشتروا الضلالة بالهدى والعذاب بالمغفرة فما أصبرهم على النار.
They are the ones who brought error in exchange for true guidance and chastisement in exchange for forgiveness. How patient they are in enduring the fire.
ذلك بأن الله نزل الكتاب بالحق وإن الذين اختلفوا في الكتاب لفي شقاق بعيد.
This is so because Allah sent down the book with the truth. But those who disagreed concerning the book veered far away from the truth.
ليس البر أن تولوا وجوهكم قبل المشرق والمغرب ولكن البر من آمن بالله واليوم الآخر والملائكة والكتاب والنبيين وآتى المال على حبه ذوي القربى واليتامى والمساكين وابن السبيل والسائلين وفي الرقاب وأقام الصلاة وآتى الزكاة والموفون بعهدهم إذا عاهدوا والصابرين في البأساء والضراء وحين البأس أولئك الذين صدقوا وأولئك هم المتقون.
Righteousness is not turning your faces towards the east or towards the west. True righteousness consists in believing in Allah and the last day, the angels, the book, and the prophets, and in giving away one's property in love of Him to one's kinsmen, the orphans, the poor, and the wayfarer, and to those who ask for help, and in freeing the necks of slaves, and in establishing prayer and dispensing the purifying alms, zakah. True righteousness is attained by those who are faithful to their promise once they have made it, and by those who remain steadfast in adversity and affliction, and at the time of battle between truth and falsehood. Such are the truthful ones, such are the God-fearing. Righteousness is not turning your faces towards the east or towards the west. Turning one's face towards the east or the west is mentioned here only by way of illustration. The actual purpose of the verse is to emphasize that the observance of certain outward religious rites, the performance of certain formal religious acts out of conformism, and the manifestation of certain familiar forms of piety do not constitute that essential righteousness which alone carries weight with God and earns His recognition and approval.
يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم القصاص في القتلى الحر بالحر والعبد بالعبد والأنثى بالأنثى فمن عفي له من أخيه شيء فاتباع بالمعروف وأداء إليه بإحسان ذلك تخفيف من ربكم ورحمة فمن اعتدى بعد ذلك فله عذاب أليم.
Believers, retribution is prescribed for you in cases of killing. If a free man is guilty, then the free man. If a slave is guilty, then the slave. If a female is guilty, then the female. But if something of a murderer's guilt is remitted by his brother, this should be adhered to in fairness, and payment be made in a goodly manner. This is an alleviation and a mercy from your Lord, and for him who transgresses after that, there is a painful chastisement. Believers, retribution is prescribed for you in cases of killing. Retribution, that is, blood revenge, is based on the principle that what a person has done to others ought to be done to him. This does not mean that the murderer should be put to death in exactly the same manner as he killed, but that the murderer should be subjected to the same act, for instance, killing, as that to which he subjected his victim. If a slave is guilty, then the slave. If a female is guilty, then the female. In pre-Islamic Arabia, people tried to take blood revenge upon the murderer's family and tribe, and the retaliation corresponded to the value placed on the blood of the victim. Their desire for revenge was not quenched merely by putting the murderer to death. They preferred to put to death tens and even hundreds of people to avenge the one life they had lost. If a respected member of their tribe was killed by an ordinary member of another, it was not deemed enough to put to death the actual murderer. They preferred to kill a man of the murderer's tribe equal in standing to the victim, and even several members of the murderer's tribe. However, if the victim was a man of humble standing from another tribe, and the murderer from their tribe happened to be a man of high standing, they were unwilling to permit the execution of the murderer. This attitude is not confined to the ignorance of that bygone age. Even today, those nations that are supposedly the most civilized will often proclaim officially and quite brazenly that if one of their citizens is killed, they will execute scores of the killer's compatriots. In addition, we often hear that to avenge the murder of one person, a large number of hostages belonging to the subject nation have been shot dead. One of the civilized nations of the present century subjected the whole Egyptian nation to blood revenge because one of their officials, Sir Lee Stack, was killed by an Egyptian. The courts of justice of these so-called civilized nations have been known to refrain from passing the death sentence on convicted homicides when they happen to be members of the ruling nation, while their victims belong to the subject nation. It is iniquities such as these that God seeks to end by means of the directive contained in this verse. What God says here is that the killer ought to be put to death irrespective of his status and that of the victim. But if something of a murderer's guilt is remitted by his brother, the very use of the word brother in this context suggests that as a general rule one ought to incline towards leniency. Despite the bitterness felt towards someone who has shed the blood of, say, one's father, the murderer is still one's brother by virtue of being a member of the human family. Hence, if one who has been wronged can overcome the vengeful spirit aroused by his erring brother's deeds, this attitude of forgiveness will be worthy of his humanity. This verse also makes it clear that according to the Islamic penal law, the question of homicide can be settled by the mutual consent of the two parties. It is the prerogative of the heirs of the victim to forgive the murderer, and if it is exercised, not even a judge has the power to insist on carrying out the death sentence. In such a case, however, as the following verse mentions, the murderer will be made to pay blood money. This should be adhered to in fairness. The term maruf occurs quite frequently in the Quran. It refers to conduct which is reckoned fair and equitable by the generality of disinterested people. The generally accepted usages and customs of life are called urf and maruf in Islamic terminology, and they are considered valid in all those matters not specifically regulated by the Sharia. And for him who transgresses after that, excess might consist of trying to avenge the blood of the murdered man even after his heirs have settled the matter and received blood money, or of efforts on the part of the murderer to delay the payment of blood money, thus repaying the heirs of the victim with ingratitude for their kindness and goodwill.